Hey guys, welcome to the first episode of Let's Write a Novel. I've been thinking about this now for a few weeks, as quite a few of you know. It's taken me this long to start doing recordings for it. Mainly because I've gone through different pieces of equipment, trying to do it with other systems. Hasn't worked out yet, so I'm going to use my Sony mirrorless here, which is actually the best quality camera I have, so that's a plus. But it's static. I was kind of hoping to do some more dynamic stuff. Anyway, that's the explanation for why this episode is running late. The goals that I have through this series is I'm going to write a novel. I'm going to bring you guys along on the journey. And I hope you guys are going to work on your own novels alongside. To that end, I'm going to be discussing techniques that can be implemented, how to refine your ideas. I'm going to be answering questions. Basically, all of that stuff. As much of a tutorial as you can apply to something like this, although, frankly, I don't really think that tutorial is going to be the right thing. We're just going to have to see how it works out. Now, for people who have happened in on this video through, I don't know, YouTube's algorithm, or maybe a friend shared it, you don't know who I am. My name is Evan Curry. I've been a professional novelist for, I think, about 8 years now. It used to be my hobby, now it's my career. Good way to do things. I've got about 30 books, give or take, been translated into half a dozen languages, that sort of thing. It's my full-time job is basically what I'm saying. So that's my credentials. Does that mean that I can teach you how to write a novel? No. But I can bring you along on the journey, and if you happen to pick some things up that are useful to you, awesome. To that end, if you've got any questions, put them down in the comments below. Hit me up on Facebook, on Twitter, or join up with my newsletter. I'll put all this information down in the link description below, along with the location of my author's page on Amazon. You can go check it out. I write mostly military science fiction, so that's going to have an effect on the processes that I use, but most of it should apply fairly cleanly across the board. Okay, so all of that's out of the way. Now we're going to talk about the first episode. And in this first episode, we're going to focus mostly on the idea. We all have them. Everybody you know has at some point or another told you, yeah, I have a great idea for a novel, or I've got this amazing idea for a screenplay. Almost none of them ever actually put it down on paper or word processor. So how do we go from the concept to the actual implementation? Now, there's a lot of ways we can do this. I'm going to talk about a few of them. As we go along, we're gonna try and figure out which ones work for you, which ones you can deal with. And this is going to be the most important lesson probably of the entire series, and I'm going to give it to you right up front. The right technique is the technique you can use. Doesn't matter if some Harvard graduate or some professional novelist says this is how it's done. Whatever the best technique is the one that actually works for you. Simple as that. It's the best tool is the one that works for you. Don't forget that. By all means, learn all the rules. Learn the right way to do things. Just be ready to throw them out if they get in the way. So, to the end of how I develop an idea. And this can vary from book to book, because some ideas, they just come more clearly established than others. And some are just much vaguer. So I'm going to approach this particular one with a vague idea. Okay? In fact, the original premise of the one novel that I'm going to be working on through this series, well, one of them, I always work on a few at the same time, because that lets me kind of shift off if I'm blocked on one novel. But I'm going to focus on 2 or 3 through this series to use as examples. And they're the ones I'm working on currently. And for the idea for this first episode, I was approached actually by a friend who asked me if I could write a book about a subject. Okay. I'm not going to get into the details and so forth because this is, well, it's spoilers to a degree, but it's also not particularly relevant what the exact subject is. But I was basically offered a just kind of a one-line concept, which is about as vague as it gets. And my usual response when somebody does this, and it happens from time to time, as I'm sure it happens for anybody who does writing, is that, yeah, that could be cool, why don't you write it? You know, because I've got 4 different books on the go and I don't have time. But in this case, it wasn't so much that the idea spoke to me, but it did trigger a series of thoughts going forward into the future, and that over the next few months, and actually now it's been 2 years since I was approached with this idea, this concept, I've been slowly refining the world. I've been building the world in my mind. And this is a process that can take time, or it can be very quick. When I wrote Steam Legion, which is one of the books that I have up for sale on Amazon, that one is independently published. It took me 5 weeks from concept to clicking publish, which is ridiculously fast. One of the reasons I love independent publishing. But sometimes it can take years to develop an idea. In this case, we're going to look at one that took a little while longer to percolate, and we're going to go through the steps that defined it, that have caused it to develop into what it is now. I decided I wanted to write a story about a society affected by ecology. This is actually what Frank Herbert started with when he was writing Dune. Okay? In my case, I'm not talking about a desert planet, I'm not talking about spice and Fremen and worms and all that. But it's still, the core concept is, how does ecology affect society? And the ecological scenario that I decided to go with is one that we're looking at today, a potential in our future. And that is, of course, the possibility of how bad can climate change get. Whether you believe in man-made climate change or not is almost irrelevant in this particular case. I'm approaching it from the perspective of, we're coming close up on the possibility of a runaway greenhouse effect. Now, right there means you got to start doing some research, because you have to understand what kind of climate, how is the ecology changing, how could it change, and you have to choose what scenario you're going to follow through. In this case, I decided to go with the runaway greenhouse effect. And I had to figure out, okay, well, how bad could that potentially get? As it turns out, pretty bad. Venus would be an example of a runaway greenhouse effect. And some people are like, well, Venus is hotter because it's closer to the sun. Not really. Venus is actually within the Goldilocks zone of our star. Which means, yes, it should be hotter, but there still should be liquid water on the surface, in theory. In practice, the composition of your atmosphere has a lot more to do with the temperature of the planet than the proximity to the star. And Venus is a runaway greenhouse effect. Earth is potentially leaning in that direction. We're nowhere near that range yet. But I decided that for this novel, I'm going to focus on a planet that survived skimming the edge of that effect. A planet that's been bloodied, they've been beaten, but they're not broken. Okay, they've come out the other side and they're stronger. But society is going to be changed by it. Okay, what did they have to do to survive? How did they adapt? These are elements that are going to be incorporated into the novel. And they give me arbitrary limits on what I can, on my starting point, which is actually really important. If you have infinite starting points you can begin with, it can be very difficult to choose where to start. In this case, early on, I'm going to slap a lot of arbitrary limits. Things that they may or may not stick with the novel as we progress, but they're going to give me an idea where I want to begin. For one thing, in order to have gone close to the edge of a runaway greenhouse effect and then pulled out the other side, we're not talking near future. This is not decades in the future, this is centuries. And even then, I'm probably minimizing it a lot. But I'm going to go arbitrarily, I'm going to say 500 years in the future. That's going to be my starting point. Then I'm going to decide, okay, well, what kind of society will have developed under those kind of stressors? Well, I think we can see today, looking around at isolation and so forth, is that there's a lot of potential for negative impacts on society when you add these stressors. So I'm going to be exploring a lot of those. And again, this is all background. This is stuff that's not going to necessarily be obvious to the reader to begin with, but it gives me a starting point. It gives me an idea of who the characters are, what they've grown up with. Similarly, because I write military science fiction, and I happen to love spaceships and all that jazz, I'm going to decide that there was a colony attempt, or not a colony attempt, there was a colonial period. At some point, people fled Earth. Things were getting so bad here that they built ships and they left. But they left a lot of people behind. The people who were left behind, they're not going to be so happy about that. And the people who left are going to kind of look at Earth as the old world bumpkins sort of thing. That's another arbitrary limit. It gives me an idea where to start. Now, I hope you can see how just developing the background of the world can flesh things out in your mind and figure out where you're beginning from. And the more arbitrary limits you can put on yourself, the more clear your path forward is going to become. Ideally, you want to put as many of these arbitrary restrictions on yourself to begin with, that your path is so clear it's the only way forward. Then it becomes simplicity itself to write. Now, going forward in the next episode, we're going to be looking at characterization, developing new characters, and all of the little problems that come up with that. And more widely, we're going to be looking at world building, which is really an extension of what I've been talking about right now, because this, in developing the initial idea, is world building. So we're going to flow from that. In episode 2, we're going to flow into more looking at the world as it is, rather than the world as it was in this story, and how the characters fit into it. So what I'm hoping that you guys do is you start developing your own idea. Make some notes. Okay? Get things ready. Don't necessarily start writing yet, but definitely get some ideas down. And then next week we're going to talk about your characters and the world they live in, rather than the world that has produced them. You know, the past. Instead of the past, we're going to talk about the present for the characters. So, if you have any questions concerning the subject of this particular episode, put them down below, send them to me on Twitter, as I said before, so on and so forth. I'll try to respond to all of them either directly, or I will put them all together and I'll do a Q&A video in between episodes. So yeah, if you want to follow along, and I really hope you do, click subscribe, ring the bell. You guys know the drill here on YouTube. That'll let you know when the next episode's up. I will be giving you an idea of my progress with each episode, and I want to know your progress. Yeah, seriously, let me know where you're at. When we're done, the idea is for all of us together. We're going to go up, we're going to follow this right through to finishing the novel. We're going to talk about editing. Then we're going to go and we're going to talk about how to publish on Amazon, because this particular novel I'm probably going to self-publish. So I'm hoping that all of us can go forward and we can click publish together and we can have a whole bunch of new novels come out. We'll share each other's links if you guys are interested. We'll try and spread it around, get as many people into to know about them as possible. And then after that's all done, we're going to talk more seriously about marketing, which I have to admit is probably going to be the hardest part of this entire series. But until next time, let's write a novel.